Chapter 3. A Boy, a Kite, and a Bridge. Before long, other men like Porter came to Niagara Falls and started building hotels, shops, houses, and restaurants. A man named William Forsythe built a fancy hotel on the Canadian side called the Pavilion Hotel. He also built a covered walkway that led down the steep cliff to the foot of the falls. Now tourists could get a good view at the bottom without risking their lives on the way down. At the bottom, they could walk behind the falls and stand behind the huge curtain of water. They could also walk into the Cave of the Winds behind the waterfall. Pretty soon, Niagara Falls became a huge tourist attraction. By 1845, more than 50,000 people were coming to see it every year. A ferry boat was built to take people from the U.S. side to Canada. It was named the Maid of the Mist because it sailed through all the mist and spray coming from the waterfall. But there was still one thing missing, something the businessmen knew they needed. They needed a bridge so that tourists could cross the gorge. There was only one problem. Even at the narrowest spot, the gorge was 800 feet wide. To build a bridge, a sturdy cable had to stretch across the two cliffs. How could that be done? The water below the cliffs was too choppy. The whirlpool rapids were right where they wanted to build the bridge. If a boat tried to take the cable across the river, the rapids would swallow up the boat. One man, an engineer named Charles Aloud Jr., had some ideas. At first, he thought about shooting a rocket from one side of the gorge to the other. If the rocket had a rope attached, that would do the trick. Or maybe he could shoot a cannonball out of a cannon with a rope attached. Then someone came up with a better idea. Why not hold a kite flying contest? Maybe someone could fly a kite from one side of the river and make it land on the other side. The thin kite string would be stretched across the gorge. Then a thicker string could be tied to the end of the kite string in Canada. Someone in America would pull it across the gorge. After that, thicker and thicker ropes would be tied and pulled across. Eventually, Aloud would be able to pull a thick metal cable across the gorge. The thick cable was the first step in building a suspension bridge. What is a suspension bridge? Many famous bridges, including the Golden Gate Bridge and the Brooklyn Bridge, are suspension bridges. A suspension bridge is built so that the weight of the roadway or deck of the bridge is held up by cables. The cables are supported by two tall towers, one on each side of a waterway. The towers must be very strong, built out of stone, bricks, or concrete. The two main cables hang down in an arch from the top of the towers. All the weight of the bridge is suspended or hangs down from them. Smaller cables dangle from the main cables and hold up the deck of the bridge. The kite flying contest was announced. Aloud offered a prize of $10. That was a lot of money in 1848. A 16-year-old boy named Holman Walsh was one of the contestants. Holman lived in the United States, but he knew the winds were best on the Canadian side of the river. On a cold day in January, Holman took a ferry boat over to Canada. Then he walked 2 miles downriver to where the bridge was going to be built. He put his kite up in the air and let it drift across the river. All day long, Holman let out balls of string so his kite would reach the far shore. Then he waited. At midnight, the wind would die down. His kite would fall on the American side. He would win! But when the kite fell to the ground, the string broke. Now Holman was stranded in Canada at midnight alone. And he couldn't get back home because there was too much ice on the river. The ferry boats weren't running. For the next 8 days, Holman had to stay in Canada. Luckily, some nice people took him in. When the ferry boats were finally running again, he went back to the U.S. side and found his kite. He fixed the broken string. Then he went back to Canada and tried again. This time, it worked. His kite reached the far shore, and Holman Walsh won the contest. Charles Aloud Jr. built a temporary bridge across the gorge, but it was only the first of many. John Roebling, a famous bridge builder, finished the bridge over Niagara Falls. Later, he went on to build the Brooklyn Bridge. As the years went by, some Niagara bridges collapsed and some had to be rebuilt several times. Sometimes bridges fell because the ice on the river jammed into the bridge supports and knocked them down. Sometimes strong winds and storms did damage. A sign on John Roebling's bridge warned that people would be fined if they galloped their horses across the bridge. There was also a fine for marching in step or marching to music. But the Aloud Bridge was the beginning. And from the bridge, tourists had a perfect view of the crazy, dangerous things some people would soon do at Niagara Falls. The day Niagara Falls went dry. Just a few months after Holman Walsh flew his kite across the gorge, something strange and terrifying happened. All of a sudden, just after midnight on March 29, 1848, Niagara Falls went dry. Millions of gallons of water had been rushing across the falls for thousands of years. That night, it just stopped. People woke up in their beds because of the silence. They were so used to the sound of rushing water that the quiet woke them up. Everyone went outside to see what had happened. To their amazement, there was no water in the river. No water rushing over the falls. They could walk right across the dry riverbed. At first, no one could explain what had happened. People went to church and prayed. They thought the end of the world had come. But before long, about a day later, the water came rushing back. What had happened? An unusually strong wind had blown huge chunks of ice across Lake Erie. The ice formed a dam. It blocked the water from flowing out of Lake Erie and into the Niagara River. When the ice jam cleared, the water came rushing back. Niagara Falls was back in business. The world wasn't going to end after all.